Hey everyone, and welcome to part 2. In this video, I'm going to cover how we can call the API endpoint we created in the previous video. And additionally, I'm also going to cover how we can display the data on a Webflow page. And we're going to do this using client-side rendering. So before we do that, I just want to do a quick recap. So on screen here, I have the API workflow we created in the previous video. And as you can see, we've got the ID, the name, the logo, the games played, won, drawn, and lost for each team. Now this data is being fetched from Airtable, and you may notice that there is now an additional column. Unfortunately, I completely forgot about the points column, which is arguably the most important column in the league table. So I have since added that. And just to go over that quickly, if we go to the root view, here we'll see we've got two new roll-ups. So we've got the home matches points and the away matches points. And then we've also got a formula field, which is a sum of the points. And then on the summary page, I've also included it here and added a sort so that the data returned will be returned from like the team at the top of the table to the team at the bottom. So I just want to show you quickly how we can add that additional column into MiddleLink, because I think it will be very beneficial, because at the end of the day, we very rarely like create a workflow and forget about it. You usually have to go back and either add things or change things or modify things. So in order to do that, I'm going to run the workflow. I'm then going to go to the column filter. And here we can see we've got the field points. So I'm going to select it and save, run the workflow again, go to the column rename, and then I'm going to add the points column in. Save the node and run. And now we can see the output includes the ID, the name, the logo, the games played, won, drawn, and lost, but it also includes the points now. So we've got everything we need. Now I'm not going to add it into the table because it's not worth anyone's time to watch me try and design within Webflow. So I'm going to leave that to those watching the video. If you've got any questions, just feel free to reach out. Instead, now we're going to jump into the JavaScript side of things. You'll be happy to know that we're going to do this visually. So I'm going to head over to components.io. So components.io is our sister product, and it was designed to make it easier for MiddleLink users who were in the MiddleLink beta. And it's like getting a lot of love from the community, so I thank everyone for that. But I would like to mention that it is in early alpha. So if you would rather use a more mature no-code tool, so for example, Weblocks, or even say FinSuite's new JavaScript API for their attribute solution, then you can use MiddleLink with those. That's not a problem. But for those who would like to have a play around with this and use petite-vue, then please carry on watching, and then I'll run through that now. So to give you a quick overview, it's components.io, the petite-vue builder, is a visual development tool, and it lets you create JavaScript using drag and drop blocks. And this is based off Google's Blockly product, which is open source. Behind the scenes, the real magic to this is petite-vue, and we take no credit for petite-vue at all. So petite-vue was developed by Evan Yu, who was the developer behind Vue.js. Extremely talented individual. So petite-vue is an alternative distribution of Vue, optimized for sprinkling a small amount of interactions on an existing HTML page rendered by a server-side framework. So an example of this would be Webflow or Visoli. It's extremely lightweight, so it's 6 kilobytes, it's open source, and it lets you leverage like client-side templating and reactivity. So if we launch the builder, there are some notifications, and I'd like to just run through these. It may take a minute or so, but this is very important. So both this tool and petite-vue are very new. There are probably bugs and there may still be API changes, so we advise caution and you are using it at your own risk. Now, if you are a middle link paid user, then you will get additional support, and we are more than welcome to help you and audit the code that you're generating, or if you just have any questions, feel free to reach out. Now, if you're not a middle link paid user, then you will have limited support, as this is an alpha product. As it progresses through to a beta and then an official release, then of course there will be greater support. It's just as it's an alpha at the moment, and we are effectively bootstrapped, we can't offer an extremely high level of support on it as an alpha product if you're not paying for one of our other services. Now, additionally, arguably the most important thing to mention is security. So petite-vue is a secure application, or should I say framework, but there are some things to bear in mind. So petite-vue evaluates JavaScript expressions in the template. This means if petite-vue is mounted on a region of the DOM that contains non-sanitized HTML from user data, it may lead to XSS attacks. And if you're not familiar with XSS, it's cross-site scripting, and it can result in numerous issues, for example, redirects, extracting user tokens, and all sorts of things. So if you're not familiar with JavaScript, or you like this is kind of over your head, then I would recommend using an alternative service for now. If you want us to build a component for you, then we're more than happy to do that, and that is a paid service. But yeah, we just advise caution. So for those who are JavaScript developers and just want a bit more clarity on how this could be an issue when working in Webflow, so Webflow users should not mount the application to a region of the DOM that includes user-generated CMS content. So for example, say you've created a marketplace and you're outputting like CMS data in a CMS collection, and users can submit a form which say goes to Zapier, and then Zapier creates CMS collections that are effectively user generated. If you were to mount the application within that CMS collection, there could be the possibility for a user to add malicious code that would be evaluated in the browser. So this is just something to bear in mind. Again, if you would like us to perform any audits on what you're writing and you're a paid middle link user, we're more than happy to. If you're unsure and you're not a middle link paid user at the moment, unfortunately, I would advise against using it until we progress into like an official release where it's more supported. But if you've got questions, of course, just reach out and we'll do our best to help. So that's the disclaimers and the notifications. Now we can get into the fun part. So how does it work? So this is primarily built around petite-vue. So we're not going to be using like standard JavaScript event listeners, so like click event listeners, or getting elements by ID, or updating values using text content. It's really going to be like state driven. So to get started, we're going to drag the create app block, and this has got a selector. And this is basically going to be the selector on the page where we're going to mount the application. We don't have to worry about that too much right now. Once we've finished building the blocks out and we jump into Webflow, it will make a lot more sense. So now we've done that, we want to define some variables. So if we just take a quick look at the page we're building, so I can close that now. So effectively, we're going to be outputting teams, and we've also got a loader. So we're going to need a list of the teams, and then we're also going to want some form of identifying whether it's loading or isn't loading. So if I go back to the builder, I'm going to go to variables, and there's two types of variables. For this video, I'm going to keep it simple. We're not going to use app level variables, and we're also not going to be creating like reusable components. There'll be another video on how to convert what we're creating in this video into reusable components. But for now, I'm going to keep it nice and simple because there is quite a lot to take in. So I'm going to go to variables, and I'm going to add the variables block within the create app. Now I'm going to call the variable teams. Then I'm going to click the cog, and this will let us add additional variables. So I'll drag this underneath teams, and I'm going to call this isLoading. Okay, so now we've got two variables. I'll click the cog again to close it. So now we want to set the initial state for these. So I'm going to go to lists, and I'm going to drag empty list onto the teams, and I'm going to go to logic. I'm going to drag the Boolean onto the isLoading and set it to false because we want to initialize it to false. To be honest, in this instance, you could initialize it to true, but I'm not going to. So now we've set up our variables, we need to create a function. So I'm going to go to functions, and I'm going to add this function. We don't need a return value. We just need something to call that will then do something for us. So I'm going to rename this to fetch data. And like that. And then within here, the first thing I want to do when a user calls this is change the loading state to true, because then we can use that state to show and hide the loading SVG. So I'm going to drag set is loading. I'm going to go to logic again and drag the Boolean block. So now when this function is called, isLoading will be set to true. Now after we've done that, we want to make an API call. So I'm going to go to the fetch category section. I'm going to drag the big fetch block in and add it underneath within the function fetch data. I'm going to leave this as get because we're making a get request to middle link. And if you're unsure what you're doing in middle link, you can go to the settings, and here you can see the method is get because we're getting data. So I'll close that and go back to here. So that's great. Next, we need to set the URL. So I'm going to go to the text category section, drag an empty text block, and then I'm going to go back to middle link and copy the API endpoint. I'm going to paste that in here. And then here you can add headers. Now we don't need any headers for this example, but I anticipate that after this video, some people are going to go far beyond what I'm showing here and start integrating member stack to enable authentication. So I'm just going to show you a quick example on how to do that. Although if you're following along specifically with this tutorial, you can pause for the next 40 seconds or so. So I'm going to go to the JSON section or category. I'm going to add the object. And then I'm going to add a property. And if you're using middle link, authentication tokens should be passed with the key XAuth token. So we've got XAuth token. And you can go down to integrations and drag the member stack block. So this is just, again, an example. If someone's looking to integrate member stack, then you can do this. And then within middle link, you would go to the documentation, read the member stack integration, add an authentication integration, and then within the workflow, you would just select it from the drop down. Now that's outside of the scope of this tutorial, but just to cover it, because I know people are going to ask, it's one of the pretty much all of our middle link users are using an authentication service with it. So I'm going to remove that for now because it's like I say, it's outside the scope of this video. So next, we've got several options. So we've got success. So if the request was successful, what do we want to do? So in this instance, we want to update the teams list that we defined up here. So I'm going to drag the set block down, and then I'm going to go to the fetch options, and then we've got two options here. So we can either get the data returned, which is all the data, or we can get a property within the data returned. And for this example, if we go to middle link, we can see this is the data being returned, and it is a list of the teams. So we don't need to do anything fancy. We can just drag this block and connect it. Brilliant. Next, you've got error and catch, and these two are different. And again, the disclaimer at the beginning of this, when this page loads, that things could change. This could be one of the things that changes based on feedback. Again, this is an alpha. So an error is an API error. So say you're making a request and you are passing a member stack token and that token has expired, then an API error would be returned. So that would run code within here. Alternatively, say for example your internet dropped, then rather than an API error, it would be a catch error. Similarly, one of the most common catch errors that we see with middle link users is people when they first sign up and they add their allowed hosts. If they add a host for a different project and then they're using the same project, they forget to update the URL, that will return a cause error. So just to kind of explain the difference between these two. So for now, I'm going to keep this very simple. I'm just going to add a log, and I like to add a text block just so it doesn't look invisible. And we'll just put an API error, and we'll copy that and remove API. Just so then we can identify whether it was like an API error or just a normal error. And you can add more descriptive errors. This is like a tutorial rather than how to create a production-ready app with full error handling. Now we've got the finally block. Now the finally block is run either way. So whether it was a successful request or whether the API errored, it will still call finally. So what would you want to do here? So in this instance, what we'd want to do is update the loading state because we would have finished loading by this point. So I'll copy the loading block, paste it below, and set this to false. Now, another thing you may want to do here is say, for example, you are using a drop-down within this row. So for anyone who saw the CoinGecko example I showed at the show and tell earlier this week, that had a drop down within the table row that then displayed like a options to go to other pages. Now, Webflow's drop down relies on its interactions, and as these elements are being rendered after the page loads, you effectively need to reset Webflow, specifically the IX2 animations. Or interactions, shall I say. So here there is a restart Webflow block, and you can drop that in there. And then what that will do is it will just reset it behind the scenes. It doesn't like reload the page or anything like that. It just like tells Webflow to reload. So then the drop downs and interactions and things like that work. And I'd like to just thanks Alex Inglesias for open sourcing the restart Webflow function. It was something we were using in Viewflow, but he added some additional things that were very elegant. So yeah, shout out to him. Credit where credit is due. But for now, I'm not going to add that because I'm going to keep this simple and show you the output. So I think we've pretty much got everything there. So we've got our app, we've got two variables, we've got our teams, which is an empty list. Then we've got is loading, which initializes to false. Then got a function called fetch data. When it's called, it sets is loading to true. It then makes a get request to our API endpoint. If it's successful, it updates the teams variable with the data returned. If an API error occurs, it logs it to the console. If an error is caught, it logs it to the console. And then finally, the loading state is set to false. So the next thing we want to do is go to the code section. And here you can see we've got the code output. So we can copy this. And I just want to also mention where this is a free tool, we don't support like JavaScript hosting at the moment, and it's not something I plan on doing in the near future. So if you want to like save these, then you can use the export and import button. Again, this is an alpha, and we will do our best for backwards compatibility. But yeah, things could change. But the code that's output will work irrespective of any changes because it's separate. Provided it's been formatted right and you've got the blocks in the right order, of course. So I've copied the code. I'm going to go over to Webflow. I'm going to go to the page settings, go to the body before the closing tag and paste it. And then you can do Command A, Shift Tab to format it. And then if there's any spaces or blank lines, you can remove those as well. Now we've added the JavaScript code, we can focus on the Webflow side of things. So in order to do this, we're going to be using data attributes. And I'm going to refer to these as View Directives to avoid any confusion with other products currently available. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the lead component, and we're going to need to specify where the app is going to be mounted. So if we jump back into components, you can see here in the create app block, we've got the selector. And here you can see it's effectively going to mount to an element with the ID app. So if I go back to Webflow, I'm going to need to add a div with the ID app. So I'll add a div, and I'll place the lead component inside the div. I'm also going to give it the class app just to make it clear that this is where the app is being mounted. And I'm going to go to the settings and add the ID app. Perfect. Next, we need to add some view directives. So the first one I'm going to add is vscope. And this effectively will let us scope the variables we defined and the functions we defined to this element on the page. And this will become a lot clearer in the next videos where we componentize the code more. So just to cover that briefly, what you can do is, as well as creating the app, you can also create components, and this is extremely powerful. So for example, say you've got multiple tables on a page, you could move what we created in this video into a component, set up props, and then effectively have one JavaScript block that works across multiple UI components on the page, and you can pass different data into each component. And this is an extremely powerful feature, but we're not going to cover that in this video. I'll save that for another one. So back to the view directives. So I'm going to add v-scope. And if you read the petite-vue documentation, you'll see that you don't actually need a value. At this time, it's not possible to add a attribute in Webflow without a value. So I'm just going to pass an empty JSON object and then click save. Next, we're going to want to call our fetch data function when the app is mounted. So again, if we jump back to components, we can see we've got our function called fetch data. So I'm just going to copy that. And then typically, if you're familiar with JavaScript, you'd normally use like an event listener for like when the page is loaded. In Vue, it's a bit different. So we do have event listeners, and to access them, you use the v-on directive. So we'll do v-on, and then typically you would do like :click or something like that. Now the lifecycle hooks are a bit different. So instead, we're going to do v-on : view : mounted. So what this means is effectively when the app is mounted, then something will happen. And here we can just enter our function name. So I'm going to do fetch data. And then I also like to add the parentheses, because then if you're passing any data into it, then it just makes it easier. It makes it a bit clearer for people who are then expanding upon these videos. So I'll click save. So we've got the app set up, we've set the scope, and we're going to call a function when it's mounted. Next, we're going to want to set up the directive so that this row in our table is rendered for each item in our list. So if we take a look here inside of the component, we've got a table, which is effectively like our wrapper. The first row is the headers, and the second one is the data row. So this is going to act as our template for all of the rows, and then we're going to dynamically update the variables. So in order to do that, we're going to click the element, we're going to go to the settings, and we're going to add another view directive. So I'm going to add the v4 directive. So we'll do v-4, and this is probably my favorite directive. And this lets you, for example, loop over an array of items. And then for each item, it will render that element. So I'm going to do item in teams. Now, the teams here relates to the variable we defined in our application. And then item can be whatever you like. You could change this to XYZ, or you could even use, for example, team. So then it would be for team in teams. I personally prefer to use item because then I don't need to rename all of the instances where I use it. If I'm, for example, using this component on another site to render something that isn't teams. So say I'm rendering reviews, then if I'd done team in teams, I'd need to replace team with all of the instances where I'd done review. I could leave it, but like it would get complicated. So my personal preference is to use item. You can use whatever you like. So I'll save that. Next, it's good practice to add a key, and this just helps with performance, and it's good practice in Vue. So in order to do that, we're going to use the v-bind directive. So I'll do v -bind :key. And then we're going to need a unique value to bind to each element that's going to be created. So if we go back into middle link and we take a look at the data that's being returned, and we're going to look at the JSON representation here. Here you can see we've got an ID, and this is the Airtable record ID. So we know this is going to be unique, so we can use the ID. So go back into Webflow, and I'm going to do item.id. Again, this item refers to the item we set up here, and that's how you can access the data when you're using v4. So within the v4, if you want to say get the team name, then you can do item.name in this instance. So just to take a look again, if we go down, we can see the properties we've got are lost, name, drawn, played, points, one, and logo. So I'm going to leave the logo till last because that's probably the most complicated out of the ones we're going to be using in this video. But when you're displaying text values or even arrays or objects, there's different ways to do it. So you could either use the mustache syntax and do item.name. However, from my experience with Webflow users in the middle link beta, they prefer not to do this because Webflow users are very design orientated, and it does make designs look messy within the designer. So if you don't want to do this, then that's absolutely fine. Instead, you can add a view directive. So I'm going to add a directive called v-text. I'm going to set the value to item.name. And this does the exact same as if we were to use the template syntax. Next, we're going to do the same effectively for each of these columns. So we're going to do v-text. And then this is going to be item.played. Then we've got item.one. Item.drawn. And item.lost. Now, when it comes to the image, it's a bit more complicated when you're using Airtable, and that's because Airtable attachment fields are arrays because they support multiple attachments. So how do you work with that, and how do we output, for example, one image? So if we take a look, we can see we've got our logo column. It's an array of items, and then within there we've got the ID, the URL, some like other metadata, and then we've also got the thumbnails. So we've got a full thumbnail, a large thumbnail, and a small thumbnail. Now, for this instance, I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm just going to use the URL, and that's because I know this is a small image. However, if you've got large images, you may want to use the thumbnail, say thumbnail small, for example. So we're going to go back into Webflow. We're going to select the image. We're going to add another view directive. And what we want to do is update the source attribute on the element. So to do that, we can use v-bind. So we do v-bind, and we're going to bind it to the source. Next, we want to access the image. So to do that, we can do item.logo. And as it's an array, we want to get an item from the array. And we know there's going to be at least one image in this instance. So we're going to get the first image. And then the property is the URL. So we've got item.logo, we're going to get the first item in that array. And then we want to get the URL for the first item. So I'll save that. And then the last thing we want to do is display the loader based on whether it's loading or not. So again, we'll jump back into components, and we can see we've got the variable is loading. So I'll copy that, go back to Webflow, select the loading wrapper. I'll add a view directive. And in this instance, we're going to do vShow. So effectively, if the value evaluates to true, then it will be shown. If it doesn't, it won't be. So we'll do v-show is loading. Now, there are also other attributes, other view directives that I haven't mentioned. So I highly recommend checking out the petite-vue documentation. It's a nice read. And also there are examples. And then if you go to the examples folder in the repo, you'll see some more examples. So like one thing I recommend is to take a look at the code output. And then you can also go into the petite-vue repo and take a look at how they're built. So I'm going to click save. And now we should have everything set up. So I'm going to publish the site. And then we're going to view the page. Okay, so we can see the data is loading. We've got the image, we've got the name, the games played, won, drawn, and lost. And we can see we can't see the loader. So if I refresh again, you can see the loader appeared and then it disappeared. Now, there is a bit of delay between the data being displayed. So to improve performance, what we can do is we can go into middle link, we can go to the HTTP request node, and we can enable caching. So I'll enable caching, and we support caching up to 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds at this stage. We may increase that in the future if that's something users want. But for now, I'm just going to set caching to an hour. I'll update the workflow, go back to the page, and then refresh. So this refresh is going to call Airtable, and then any future refreshes within the next hour will call the cache. So you can see there's a significant improvement there to the performance. And you can do some quite advanced things with caching as well. You can cache based on the user, and also caching takes into account parameters and things like that as well. If you've got any questions surrounding that, feel free to reach out. So I think we've covered everything I wanted to cover in this videos. If you've got any questions about Middle Link, please use the live support chat or the live chat, sorry. And if you've got any questions about components.io, you can reach us at support@components.io. If you're a paid middle link user, then feel free to send us a message via the middle link chat regarding components as well. And if you would like the idea behind this and the possibilities, but you don't want to use the tool yourself, then you can always reach out to us and we can create a component as a service. Just use this form at the bottom of the website. So again, if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out. I hope you enjoyed the video.